The rumor was huge, the headlines were wild, but the real story is even bigger because this is not just about one player anymore. This is about who controls the future of the WNBA. And before this is over, I'm going to show you the one detail that makes all of this far more serious than a normal basketball story. Because once you see it, you'll understand why every move around Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and the league gets magnified instantly. If you like smart sports breakdowns with the noise cut out and the facts left in, subscribe now, because stories like this move fast and the next twist usually hits when people least expect it. Let's start with the biggest thing first. A lot of people have been pushing dramatic claims about Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, secret meetings, panic inside league offices, and even talk about shocking moves that could supposedly flip the entire WNBA upside down. But when you strip away the hype and look at the verified facts, the story becomes clearer, sharper, and honestly more interesting. Because the real story is not that Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham secretly changed the league with some mystery contract. The real story is that the league is entering a new era where every major decision, every TV camera, every ticket sale, every foul call, every rivalry, and every player reaction gets amplified more than ever before. And that is exactly why this moment matters. So let's clean this up properly. First, there is no verified evidence that Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham signed with the New York Liberty. That claim does not hold up. What is verified is that Sophie Cunningham was acquired by the Indiana Fever in a 4-team trade, while the New York Liberty are the franchise that won their first WNBA championship in 2024. Those are two separate realities, and once you separate rumor from fact, the whole conversation changes. Now ask yourself this: why would people even believe a story that big in the first place? Because the WNBA is now in a place where any storyline tied to Caitlin Clark feels believable to the public, simply because her presence has become that powerful. She is not just a player people watch, she has become a force that affects ticket demand, TV attention, media framing, debate shows, league politics, and the way fans talk about women's basketball. That is where the real pressure begins. And keep this question in your mind as we go deeper. When one player becomes this important to the business side of a league, what happens to everybody else around her? That is where Sophie Cunningham enters the picture in a real and meaningful way. Because Sophie Cunningham is not just another name attached to a headline. She is one of those players whose style, toughness, and visibility make people pay attention. When she joins a roster that already has Caitlin Clark, it naturally creates conversation, it creates expectations, it creates scrutiny, and it creates that feeling that something larger may be building behind the scenes. Not because of a fake Liberty deal, but because the Fever suddenly look like a team the league cannot ignore. And that matters more than most people realize. The Indiana Fever were already one of the central stories in the WNBA because Caitlin Clark brought unprecedented attention with her arrival. Then the spotlight stayed there because every game became more than just a game. It became an event. Opposing teams adjusted, arena plans changed, national discussion exploded. Even people who did not regularly follow the WNBA suddenly had an opinion. That does not happen by accident. That happens when a player changes the scale of the conversation. In fact, teams literally moved games to larger arenas when Indiana came to town because the demand was too big to ignore. Las Vegas moved a Fever game from a roughly 12,000-seat arena to the 18,000-seat T-Mobile Arena. Washington also shifted a Fever game to a much bigger venue. That is not a rumor. That is demand talking. That is business talking. That is the market telling you something in plain language. And here is where the suspense really starts building. Because once demand changes, power changes. When demand changes, networks care more. When networks care more, sponsors care more. When sponsors care more, the league starts making decisions with a different kind of urgency. And when that happens, every storyline around star players becomes bigger than basketball. That is exactly the zone the WNBA is living in right now. You can see it in the media rights conversation alone. The league secured a landmark 11-year media rights deal involving Disney, Amazon Prime Video, and NBC Universal, with more than 100 regular season games set to be distributed each season. That is not a small background detail. That is one of the most important shifts in league history, because it means the WNBA is no longer just fighting for attention. It is now negotiating from a position of rising value and much bigger visibility. And that is why stories around Clark and players connected to her feel so explosive. Because now there is more money in the ecosystem, more eyes on the product, more pressure on presentation, more pressure on officiating, more pressure on team building, more pressure on the commissioner, more pressure on veteran stars, and more pressure on the league to balance growth with fairness. That balancing act is the real drama, not the fake headlines, not the made-up secret contracts, not the exaggerated conspiracy lines. The real drama is much more complicated. It is the tension between business growth and basketball culture, and that tension shows up everywhere. It shows up when fans debate whether Clark gets too much attention or not enough protection. It shows up when people argue over physical play. It shows up when veterans are compared to rookies every single day. It shows up when every broadcast package needs a face, every marketing campaign needs a centerpiece, and every rivalry gets pushed harder because attention is now currency. So when people look at Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham, what they are really reacting to is not just two players. They are reacting to what those players represent in this new era. Clark represents scale. Cunningham represents edge. Together, they create a combination that people immediately read as must-watch television, and that is why this story keeps growing. Now let's talk about the Liberty, because this is where facts matter. The New York Liberty did not become important because of a fake Clark Cunningham signing story. They became important because they are already a real power. They won the 2024 WNBA championship, the first in franchise history after beating Minnesota in the finals. So when fans attach any giant rumor to the Liberty, it spreads fast because people already see that franchise as a destination, a contender, and a symbol of the league's elite level. That is how sports rumor works. You take a player with massive star power. You combine her with a known contender. You add tension, urgency, and some vague talk of panic. And suddenly, people believe they are hearing the next league-altering bombshell. But the truth is this: you do not need a fake story to explain why the WNBA feels different now. Reality already explains it. Reality says the league is growing. Reality says the media value is rising. Reality says the audience is expanding. Reality says certain stars can move ticket sales, headlines, and public discourse at an unusual level. Reality says the pressure inside the league is probably real, even if the viral storytelling around it is often exaggerated. And this is the exact point where a lot of fans miss the bigger picture. They think the story is about whether one rumor is true or false. But the bigger story is why that rumor was believable in the first place. It was believable because people can feel the league shifting. They can feel that the old version of the WNBA and the new version of the WNBA are colliding in real time. One version is built on long-term respect, internal culture, and years of players fighting for visibility. The other version is being powered by accelerated attention, TV demand, social media velocity, and star-driven economics. And when those two forces meet, every headline becomes volatile. That is why even a false claim can catch fire. Now let's bring Sophie Cunningham back into the center of this. Because if you really want a compelling angle, it is not about inventing a blockbuster move that never happened. It is about asking what her actual presence adds to this new environment. Sophie Cunningham brings attitude. She brings experience. She brings visibility. She brings the kind of personality that fans either love immediately or talk about endlessly. And in today's media environment, that matters. Because teams are not just building lineups anymore. They are building narratives, whether they admit it or not. The teams that matter most are the ones that can compete on the floor and command attention off it. That is why every roster move around star-adjacent players becomes more significant now. Not because every move breaks the league, but because every move can reshape the conversation. And the conversation itself has become part of the league's economy. Think about that carefully. The conversation is now an asset. The buzz is now an asset. The controversy is now an asset. The spotlight is now an asset. That is the uncomfortable truth in modern sports. So when Clark gets talked about nonstop, it is not random. When Cunningham trends after a big moment, it is not random. When the Liberty, Fever, Aces, Sky, or any other major team becomes part of a massive online debate, it is not random. This is the environment now. Every league says it wants growth, but growth changes behavior. Growth changes incentives. Growth changes what gets protected. Growth changes who gets marketed. Growth changes who feels overlooked. And growth changes how fans interpret everything. That is why this entire conversation feels so charged. Now here is where I want you to pay close attention, because this may be the most important piece of the whole story. The real issue is not whether the league wants stars. Every league wants stars. The real issue is whether the league can grow around stars without making the rest of the player base feel like supporting characters. That is the challenge. That is the tension. That is the hidden battle under all the headlines. Because once one player becomes the center of the business conversation, every other star starts being measured against that commercial gravity. Not just for basketball reasons, for camera time, for sponsorship attention, for national TV value, for social traction, for story placement, for priority. And whether people admit it or not, that changes how players are discussed. It changes how fans defend them. It changes how critics attack them. It changes how the media frames conflict. And it changes how every disagreement inside the sport gets magnified into something bigger. That is why the league has to be careful. Very careful. Because the fastest way to create chaos is to let the public think the game is being bent around one player. At the same time, the fastest way to lose momentum is to ignore the player who is clearly driving unprecedented levels of attention. That is the tightrope. And no matter what anybody says publicly, that tightrope is real. Now imagine what happens when all of that pressure meets actual basketball decisions. Every hard foul becomes a debate. Every whistle becomes a debate. Every promotion becomes a debate. Every all-star conversation becomes a debate. Every endorsement becomes a debate. Every scheduling decision becomes a debate. And every roster move around Indiana suddenly gets treated like a signal for the future of the league. That is why Sophie Cunningham joining Indiana carries real weight, because fans are not just asking what she adds as a player. They are asking what kind of environment is forming around Caitlin Clark. Is Indiana building protection around its star? Is it building personality around its star? Is it building a tougher identity? Is it preparing for the reality that every opponent is going to treat Fever games like marquee matchups? Those are fair questions, and they are much more interesting than fake front office panic scenes. Let me take this one step further. The WNBA now has a visibility challenge and an opportunity at the same time. The challenge is that every conflict can become overblown. The opportunity is that every compelling storyline can bring new fans into the sport. And if the league handles that correctly, this era could become a launching point. But if it handles it poorly, then the conversation stops being about basketball and turns into constant culture war noise. That is the danger. Because once the noise takes over, facts start disappearing. And when facts disappear, the sport gets swallowed by manufactured drama. That is exactly why it matters to rewrite this story the right way. Not because drama is bad. Drama is part of sports. Rivalry is part of sports. Heat is part of sports. Debate is part of sports. But falsehood is different. Falsehood weakens the story. Truth sharpens it. And the truth here is already strong enough. Caitlin Clark has changed the scale of WNBA attention. Sophie Cunningham's arrival in Indiana gives that team another layer of edge and visibility. The New York Liberty are already champions, which is why their name carries weight in every big conversation. And the WNBA's media future is getting bigger, richer, and more exposed than ever before. That is a powerful script without inventing anything. Now let's talk about what fans should really watch next, because this is where the suspense becomes real. Watch how the Fever are covered. Watch how often they are placed in premium windows. Watch how rival teams frame games against them. Watch how physical matchups are discussed by commentators. Watch how star narratives are packaged by national media. Watch how often the conversation shifts from pure basketball to symbolism. Because once that starts happening consistently, you are no longer just watching a team. You are watching a league negotiate its own future in public. And that is exactly what makes this era fascinating. You are seeing a sport grow and argue with itself at the same time. You are seeing tradition and acceleration collide. You are seeing respect for the past compete with urgency about the future. You are seeing players who built the league demand recognition. You are seeing new stars bring in new crowds, and you are seeing the business side realize that this moment cannot be wasted. That is the real story, not a hidden Liberty contract, not a fictional meltdown, not a secret plot. The real story is that the WNBA no longer has the luxury of being discussed quietly. Everything is louder now. Everything matters more now. Everything spreads faster now. And that means the stakes are higher for everyone. For the commissioner, for the networks, for the teams, for the veterans, for the rookies, for the stars, and for the fans who are now shaping the temperature of the conversation every single day. So when you hear giant claims, slow down and ask the only question that really matters. What is verified and what is being sold for reaction? Because in this era, that question is everything. And once you start asking it, the whole picture becomes clearer. Yes, Caitlin Clark is one of the biggest engines of attention the league has seen in years. Yes, Sophie Cunningham joining Indiana adds another layer to one of the league's most watched teams. Yes, the New York Liberty are a major force after winning the championship. Yes, the WNBA's media future has expanded in a major way. And yes, all of that creates real pressure inside the league, whether people admit it publicly or not. But no, that does not mean every viral story is real. And honestly, the verified version is more revealing anyway. Because the verified version tells you that the WNBA is not dealing with one random controversy. It is dealing with growth. Growth is exciting. Growth is profitable. Growth is powerful, but growth also exposes fault lines. It exposes jealousy. It exposes insecurity. It exposes pressure. It exposes imbalance. It exposes every unresolved question about who gets centered, who gets celebrated, and who gets left behind. That is why this conversation refuses to die, and that is why the next chapter matters so much. Because the next chapter will show whether the league can turn all of this attention into long-term strength instead of short-term noise. Can it protect competitive integrity while embracing star power? Can it market its biggest names without flattening everyone else? Can it grow fast without making the game feel artificial? Can it use rivalries to attract fans without letting the discourse become toxic? Can it turn this moment into structure instead of chaos? Those are the real questions. And every big headline from here forward is going to circle back to them. So the next time you see a massive WNBA rumor tied to Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, the Liberty, or some alleged closed-door panic, remember this. The rumor may be false, but the pressure behind the rumor is probably real. The made-up twist may not exist, but the power shift people are sensing absolutely does. The fake story may fall apart, but the deeper transformation is still happening. And that is why this story is far from over. Because what we are really watching is not one trade rumor, one player feud, or one media cycle. We are watching the WNBA decide what its next era is going to look like. Will it be driven by stars? Will it be driven by parity? Will it be driven by network logic? Will it be driven by competitive culture? Or will it try to hold all of those things together at once? That is the suspense no one can answer yet, and that is exactly why so many people keep watching. Because everyone can feel that something bigger is forming, not in rumor, in reality. And the reality is this. The WNBA has entered a stage where attention is no longer the problem. Managing attention is the problem. That changes everything. It changes how teams build. It changes how stories spread. It changes how conflicts feel. It changes how stars are viewed. And it changes how the league must respond if it wants to turn momentum into legacy. So if you want the cleanest way to understand all of this, here it is. Clark is a major driver of public attention. Sophie Cunningham's move to Indiana is real and meaningful. The New York Liberty's championship status is real. The league's media expansion is real. The pressure created by those realities is real. The fake signing rumor is not. And once you remove the fiction, what remains is a much stronger story. A story about scale, a story about control, a story about visibility, a story about money. A story about power, and above all, a story about a league that is suddenly too big for quiet conversations. That is why this matters. That is why fans are locked in, and that is why the next move, the next quote, the next game, and the next controversy are all going to land even harder than before, because now the whole basketball world is watching.